Victoria Brooks first appeared at the Morning Brew Cafe on Dodge Street on a cold March morning in 2024. Tom Anderson, the owner, remembers that day clearly. A tall, slender woman with shoulder-length brown hair walked through the door at exactly 9 o'clock, just as the morning rush was getting started. "I'm looking for a job," she said, handing him a neatly typed resume. "I used to be a barista in Denver." Tom, an Iraq War veteran with piercing eyes, quickly sized her up. Victoria spoke quietly but confidently. She had experience with coffee machines, knew the basics of customer service, and had references from her previous job. A week later, she was behind the counter, memorizing the orders of regular customers. Mark Coleman was one of those regular customers. Every morning at 7:45, he stopped by for a large black coffee and a cinnamon roll before work. The owner of Coleman Construction, he had built half of the new homes in the Omaha suburbs over the past 10 years. At 42, Mark looked like the embodiment of the American dream. Strong, tanned from working in the sun, with the confident gait of a successful businessman. At home, his wife Jane and 2 children, 15-year-old Kyle and 12-year-old Emma, were waiting for him. Jane had been teaching 2nd grade at Benson Elementary School for 15 years. Their house on Maple Street was the epitome of suburban prosperity. A well-kept lawn, a swing set on the porch, and a family minivan in the garage. On Sundays, the Coleman family sat in the 3rd row at Holy Trinity Baptist Church. Mark sang in the church choir, and Jane organized charity dinners. They were the kind of family that others pointed to as an example. Victoria rented a small studio apartment on Cumming Street in an old part of town. She worked 6 days a week, saving every dollar she earned. Tom noticed that she never spent money on entertainment or unnecessary purchases. When he asked about her plans, Victoria mentioned a medical procedure she hoped to have done next year. "It will change my life," she said, wiping down the counter after closing. "I'll finally be able to be myself." Tom didn't pry. In his 30 years, including 4 tours of military service, he had learned not to ask unnecessary questions. Victoria's first month on the job went by uneventfully. She quickly learned the customers' preferences and worked efficiently and politely. Mark Coleman began coming in a little earlier, sometimes lingering at the counter for a few minutes to discuss the weather or the latest news. "How's the new job?" he asked one day in early April as Victoria was preparing his usual order. "Getting used to it," she replied. "People here are nicer than I expected." Mark nodded, took his coffee, and headed for the door. But he turned back at the door. "If you need anything, help or advice about the city, let me know. I've lived here all my life." Victoria smiled, the first real smile Tom had seen since she started working there. That evening, Jane Coleman was cooking dinner when Mark came home. "How was it?" she asked, as she had every day for the past 15 years. "The usual," Mark replied, kissing her on the cheek. "There's a new girl working at the cafe. She moved here from Denver." Jane nodded, stirring the sauce. Little things like this were part of their daily life. Short stories about work, customers, changes in their usual routine. By the end of April, Mark and Victoria's conversations were getting longer. He would come to the cafe earlier than usual, when there were fewer customers. Victoria talked about life in Denver, and he talked about construction projects and changes in the city. "You know the history of Omaha very well," Victoria remarked one morning as she made his coffee. "I was born here and went to school here," Mark replied. "I remember when this neighborhood was completely different." Their first meeting outside the cafe happened by chance. On a Saturday afternoon, Mark saw Victoria at the bus stop near the West Roads shopping center. He stopped to offer her a ride. "My car is in the shop," she explained as she got into his pickup truck. "Thanks for stopping." On the way to her house, they talked about work and their plans for the weekend. Mark noticed how she held herself, straight but tense, as if preparing for possible trouble. "People look at me funny sometimes," Victoria said when he asked if she liked Omaha. "At what?" Mark genuinely didn't understand. "At me." She paused. I'm not like most women here. Mark wanted to ask what she meant, but something stopped him. Instead, he said, everyone has a right to be themselves. At home, Jane asked why he was late. I was helping a friend whose car broke down, Mark replied. It was the truth, but not the whole truth. At church the next day, the pastor talked about the importance of honesty in marriage. Mark sat next to his wife, holding her hand, and thought about Victoria. Not about romantic feelings, not yet, but about the loneliness he had seen in her eyes. After the service, the family went to Jane's parents' house for lunch. Kyle talked about baseball practice. Emma talked about her school project on state history. Mark participated in the conversation, laughed at his father-in-law's jokes, and helped clear the table. The model son-in-law and father. But in the evening, while the children were doing their homework and Jane was checking her students' notebooks, Mark found himself thinking about Victoria, about her quiet voice, her cautious smile, how she said, I'm not like most women here. On Monday, he arrived at the cafe earlier than usual. How was your weekend? Family stuff, Mark replied. How about you? Reading, walking. She poured him some coffee. Tom gave me some books on the history of the city. It's interesting to learn about the place where you live. Tom Anderson noticed a change in his employees' behavior. Victoria had become more open and smiled more often. One evening, as he was closing the cafe, he decided to talk to her. How are your plans coming along? He asked. I remember you mentioning a medical procedure. Victoria stopped wiping the table. I'm saving up. I want to have the surgery before the end of the year. Serious? It will change my whole life. She sat down across from him. Tom, can I trust you? He nodded. I'm a transgender woman. I moved here to start a new life, far away from everyone who knew me before. The surgery will help me finally become myself. Tom was silent for a few seconds, processing the information. Thank you for trusting me, he said finally. It doesn't change anything about our work. You're a good employee and a good person. Victoria smiled, for the first time in months, without a hint of anxiety. Meanwhile, Mark felt a growing sense of unease. He found himself thinking about Victoria more often, imagining conversations with her, planning what he would say tomorrow morning. It was more than friendship, and he knew it. You seem distracted lately, Jane remarked at dinner. A lot of work, Mark replied. A new project up north. Kyle talked about the upcoming game, but Mark was barely listening. He was thinking about what would happen if his attraction to Victoria became something more, about what his wife, children, and church community would think, about what he might lose. On Friday, Victoria asked Tom to let her leave early. She had to go to the bank and the doctor. Mark happened to see her leaving the medical center on Farnham Street as he was driving home from work. He slowed down. Everything okay? He asked through the rolled-down window. Yes, just a consultation, she replied, about the procedure I'm planning. Can I give you a ride home? Victoria hesitated for a second, then nodded. They spoke little on the way home. Mark sensed tension between them, something new, uncertain, frightening. When he stopped outside her house, Victoria didn't get out right away. Mark, she said quietly, thank you for your kindness. Not everyone in this town treats people like me that way. People like you? She looked at him intently as if deciding whether she could trust him. I'll tell you someday, if you're ready to hear it. Jane Coleman was the first to notice the changes. Mark started staying late at work more often than usual. He used to always call if he was going to be late for dinner. Now he just came home at 8 instead of his usual 6, apologizing for urgent work at the construction site. You've changed, she said in mid-May after the children had gone to bed. You're distracted. Your mind is somewhere else. Mark sat in his chair with a newspaper, but he wasn't reading. I'm just tired. Lots of orders, good for business. Maybe we need a vacation? It's been a long time since we've all gone away together. Yes, maybe, he replied, without looking up. Jane sat down on the arm of his chair. "Mark, if something's wrong, you can tell me." He looked at her, his wife, the mother of his children, the woman he had loved for 15 years. He wanted to tell her everything, about Victoria, about the strange feelings he couldn't explain, about how attracted he was to someone he barely knew. "Everything's fine," he said instead. At the cafe, Victoria also noticed a change in Mark. He started coming not only in the morning but also in the afternoon, under various pretexts. He had to meet a client nearby, buy sandwiches for the workers, check if Tom needed any extra construction work. Their conversations became more personal. Mark told her how he started his business after the army and about his dreams of building a house for his family on the shores of Lake Mead. Victoria shared memories of her childhood in Denver and how difficult it was to understand herself as a teenager. "I always knew who I really was," she said one day as she handed him his coffee. "But it took the world a while to let me be myself." Mark realized then that he felt something more than friendship for her. This realization terrified him. At the end of May, Victoria received her first threatening note. Tom found it under the door of the cafe in the morning when he opened the place. "We know who you are. Get out of our town before it's too late." Victoria read the note with trembling hands. "Someone found out," she whispered. "Maybe it's just hooligans," Tom said, though he didn't believe his own words. "You should go to the police." "No," Victoria replied quickly. "It'll just attract attention. I don't want everyone to know." 3 days later, a second note arrived, this time in her mailbox. "Last warning. We don't want people like you here." Victoria didn't sleep all night, sitting by the window with Tom's baseball bat, which he had lent her for protection. In the morning, she looked exhausted. Mark noticed her condition immediately. "What happened?" She hesitated, then showed him the notes. Mark read them, feeling his insides tighten with rage and fear. "Who could have written this?" he asked. "I don't know. Someone guessed or someone told them." Victoria looked at him. "Mark, I'm scared. Maybe I really should leave." "No," he said more sharply than he intended. "You can't give in to people like that." His reaction surprised them both. Victoria saw something new in his eyes, a protective feeling that went deeper than ordinary human solidarity. Paranoia began to consume Mark. He began to notice the glances of his neighbors, colleagues, and fellow churchgoers. It seemed as if everyone knew about his feelings for Victoria. At work, he overheard 2 workers discussing the strange girl from the cafe. "There's something about her," said one. "She's too tall and her voice sounds masculine." "Maybe she's one of those," the second replied, lowering his voice. Mark abruptly interrupted their conversation, inventing an urgent task. But the seed of doubt had been sown. If the workers suspected something, then so did others. At home, he became even more withdrawn. Kyle asked him to play basketball, but Mark refused, saying he was tired. Emma wanted help with her math homework, but he sent her to her mother. "What's wrong with you?" Jane asked when the children had gone to their rooms. "You love spending time with them." "Just a lot of work. Mark, look at me." Jane took his chin, forcing him to look her in the eyes. "We've been married for 15 years. I know when you're lying." He looked away. "I'm not lying. I'm just tired." At church on Sunday, the pastor preached about temptation and faithfulness. Mark sat in the 3rd row, holding his wife's hand, feeling like an imposter. After the service, Mary Henderson, one of the senior members of the congregation, approached them. "Jane, dear, how are you?" She looked at Mark. "Mark, we haven't seen you at the men's fellowship meetings lately." "Work," he replied curtly. "I understand." Mary leaned closer. "By the way, I heard there's a new girl working at the cafe where you buy your coffee. They say she's kind of strange." Mark felt his heart beat faster. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Well, people talk." Mary shrugged. "The important thing is that decent families know who they're dealing with." On Monday, Mark arrived at the cafe in a rage. Victoria immediately sensed his mood. "What's going on?" she asked when the cafe emptied. "People are talking," he said. "About you. About us." "About us?" Victoria paled. "Mark, there's nothing between us." "But there is something." The words came out on their own. "You feel it just as I do." Victoria took a step back. "You're married. You have children." "I know!" Mark slammed his fist on the counter. "Do you think I don't know? Do you think I don't understand that this is wrong? Then why are you here?" He looked at her, not knowing what to say. Because he couldn't not come. Because she had become the only bright spot in his day. Because when he looked at her, he felt alive in a way he had forgotten during years of marriage and responsibility. "I don't know," he whispered finally. Victoria Brooks' body was found on Tuesday morning in an alley behind the Morning Brew Cafe. Garbage collector Ray Carmichael was making his usual rounds when he noticed a leg sticking out of a dumpster, wearing a pair of familiar work boots. Victoria was lying face down, her chestnut hair scattered across the asphalt. There was a wound on the back of her head from a blunt object. A bloody piece of rebar, about a foot long, lay nearby. Ray immediately called 911. The first patrol cars arrived 7 minutes later, followed by Detective Sarah Wilson. Detective Wilson had been with the Omaha Police Department's Homicide Division for 10 years. A divorced mother of a teenager, she had seen enough violence not to be surprised by human nature, but not enough to become cynical. At 38, Sarah still believed in justice and a methodical approach to investigation. "What do we have?" she asked Sergeant Davis, the first officer to arrive on the scene. Victoria Brooks, 28 years old, worked at a cafe. Davis pointed to the back door of the establishment. "A garbage man found the body around 7 this morning. Judging by the temperature and condition, the murder occurred late last night or early this morning." Wilson examined the crime scene. There were almost no signs of a struggle. Either the attack was sudden, or the victim knew the killer. A piece of rebar lay 2 meters from the body, stained with blood. "The murder weapon is here," she noted. "Either the killer dropped it in a panic, or they wanted us to find it." Tom Anderson came running when he saw the police cars. When he was told about Victoria's death, he sank down on the steps of the cafe, covering his face with his hands. "She worked until 9 yesterday," he told Detective Wilson. "I left around 8:30 and she was finishing cleaning up." "Did Miss Brooks have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to harm her?" Tom hesitated. "She received threatening letters. She showed them to me a couple of weeks ago." "What kind of threats?" "Someone wanted her to leave town." Tom looked at the detective. "Victoria was special, transgender. Not everyone in town accepted that." Detective Wilson wrote down the information. Hate crimes happened even in relatively quiet Omaha. "Do you have these letters?" "She didn't leave them. She said she threw them away." "Who else knew about her transgender identity?" "As far as I know, very few people. She was careful." Tom paused. Although recently, someone clearly figured it out. Wilson interviewed neighbors and other workers in the neighborhood. Most knew Victoria by sight, but few had interacted with her closely. She was polite, quiet, and kept to herself. "She was kind of strange," said Dorothy Miller, who owned a flower shop across the street. "Too tall for a woman with a low voice. I suspected something was wrong from the start." "What exactly did you suspect?" "Well, you know." Dorothy lowered her voice. "Maybe she wasn't really a woman." At the cafe, Detective Wilson examined Victoria's workspace. Everything was neatly tidied up, the cups were washed, the tables were wiped down, and the cash register was closed. There was no indication of a sudden interruption in her work. "She was always so organized," said Tom. "She never left a mess." "So either she finished work and met someone outside, or someone came here to meet her." Victoria's purse, found next to her body, contained the usual items: a wallet with $80, her apartment keys, lipstick, and a cell phone. It wasn't a robbery. The phone showed the last calls and messages. Most were work-related, food orders, shift schedules. The last incoming call was at 8:47 p.m. from an unknown number, lasting 12 seconds. "Check this number," Wilson told the technician, "and request a detailed report for the last month." By noon, the detective began systematic interviews. Regular customers of the cafe, neighbors, casual acquaintances. Most spoke of Victoria neutrally, a quiet, polite girl who kept to herself. Mark Coleman came to the station himself after learning of the murder from a neighbor. He looked shaken. "I bought coffee at that cafe every day," he told Detective Wilson. "I can't believe this happened." "How well did you know Miss Brooks?" "Not very well, just the usual customer salesperson chatter." Mark sat upright, his hands folded in his lap. "She seemed like a nice girl." "When was the last time you saw her alive?" "Yesterday morning when I bought my coffee, around 8 o'clock." "How did she look? Did she seem troubled?" Mark paused as if trying to remember. "Maybe a little tense, but I didn't think anything of it." Detective Wilson wrote down his answers, watching his behavior. Mark answered clearly, but she noticed that he avoided her gaze and rubbed his palm against his jeans. Typical signs of stress. "Mr. Coleman, did you know that Miss Brooks was a transgender woman?" Mark flinched as if he had been struck. "What? No, how would I know?" "So she didn't tell you?" "No, of course not, we hardly spoke." Mark's voice became more tense. "Why are you asking?" "We're looking into the possibility of a hate crime. She had received threats." Mark nodded too vigorously. "I see. Yes, some people might not have accepted that." After the interview, Detective Wilson reviewed her notes. Something about Mark Coleman's behavior seemed strange to her. His reaction to the news of Victoria's transgender identity was too strong for a simple cafe customer. That evening, Wilson received the results of the preliminary examination. Victoria had died from a blow to the back of the head with a blunt object. The rebar was indeed the murder weapon. Fingerprints were found on the metal, but they were smudged. Either the killer was wearing gloves or had tried to wipe them off. "What's interesting," said the expert, "is that this rebar is construction grade, the kind used in residential construction." Detective Wilson noted this detail. There were dozens of construction companies in Omaha, but they needed something concrete to start with. The breakthrough in the case came on the third day of the investigation. Detective Wilson received a detailed list of calls made from Victoria's phone over the past month. Among the work numbers and occasional calls to friends in Denver, one number stood out, calling her almost daily for the past 2 weeks. The number was registered to Mark Coleman. "Interesting," Wilson muttered as she studied the records. For someone who had little contact with the victim, he called her remarkably often. The last call was made on Monday at 8:47 p.m., the same 12-second conversation that Victoria's phone had recorded before she was killed. Wilson immediately requested a search warrant for Coleman's home and office. Judge Harrison reviewed the evidence and signed the documents within an hour. The search began early Thursday morning. Mark was having breakfast with his family when there was a knock at the door. Jane opened it and saw detectives with a warrant. "What's going on?" she asked, when Wilson explained the purpose of their visit. Mark turned pale when he saw the detectives. "There must be some mistake. Mr. Coleman, we'd like to talk to you about your relationship with Victoria Brooks," Wilson said. The children sat at the table, their eyes wide. Kyle held a half-eaten piece of toast in his hand, and Emma clung to her mother. "I already told you I hardly knew her," Mark replied, his voice trembling. "Then how do you explain the 37 calls to her number in the last 2 weeks?" Jane turned sharply to her husband. "What calls?" Mark opened and closed his mouth, unable to find the words. At that moment, one of the technicians entered from the garage. "Detective Wilson, we need to see this." In Mark's garage, next to his pickup truck, lay a bundle of construction rebar, exactly like the murder weapon. The expert noticed dark spots on one of the bars. "It looks like blood," he said. Mark collapsed into a chair near the workbench. "I can explain." "Then explain," Wilson said, turning on the tape recorder. Mark covered his face with his hands. "This wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't want to kill her." Jane gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth. "Mark, what are you saying?" "I fell in love with her," he said quietly. "I know how it sounds. I know what it means, but I couldn't help myself." Detective Wilson sat down across from him. "Tell me what happened on Monday night." Mark took a deep breath. "She wanted to end our relationship. She said it was wrong because I have a family. We agreed to meet at a cafe after her shift to talk. And I tried to convince her not to leave me. I told her we'd find a way to be together, but she insisted." Mark's voice became more tense. "Then she said she was going to leave anyway, that she'd saved enough money for the operation and was moving to California." Jane cried, clutching the tabletop. 15 years of marriage," she whispered. 15 years. "I panicked," Mark continued. "I realized that if she left, someone might find out about our relationship, start asking questions. It would have destroyed my family, my business, my whole life." "So you killed her?" Mark nodded, tears rolling down his cheeks. "I took a piece of rebar from the back of my pickup truck. I told myself I was just going to scare her, make her promise to keep quiet. But when she turned to leave..." He fell silent. "What happened then?" "She fell right away. I realized what I'd done, but it was too late." Mark looked at his wife. "Jane, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you or the kids." Jane turned away, unable to look at him. Detective Wilson arrested Mark on suspicion of first-degree murder. As she read him his rights, she thought about how often people destroyed everything they loved because they were afraid of losing it. At the station, Mark made a full confession. He talked about how his relationship with Victoria had started, with friendly conversations, then emotional intimacy, then a physical attraction he couldn't explain to himself. "I've never felt anything like this before," he said, "towards a man or a transgender woman. It confused me." "Did you know about her transgender identity?" "She told me a month after we met. It didn't change my feelings, but it made me realize how the town would react if it found out." Wilson studied the timeline of events. Mark and Victoria had been dating secretly for the past 6 weeks. Their relationship was both emotional and physical. Victoria fell in love with him, but understood the impossibility of the situation. "She was a good person," Mark said. "Kind, smart, dreamed of a normal life. And I ruined everything because of my selfishness and fear." When news of the arrest spread throughout Omaha, the reaction was shocking. Mark Coleman, a model family man and member of the church community, had not only cheated on his wife with a transgender woman, but also killed her to cover up the affair. Tom Anderson closed his cafe for a week after the arrest. Victoria deserved better, he told reporters. She was an honest person who just wanted to live her life. Jane Coleman filed for divorce 3 days after her husband's arrest. She took a leave of absence from her teaching job and took her children to her parents' home in Lincoln. "I didn't know this man," she told a friend. "I was married to a stranger for 15 years." The pastor of Holy Trinity Church held a special service dedicated to healing the community from sin and lies. Many parishioners were shocked not only by the murder, but also by the fact that a transgender woman had been living among them, and that one of their leaders had been in a relationship with her. At a court hearing in July, Mark pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in a plea bargain with prosecutors. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he said in his final statement. "But I hope my story will warn others against making similar mistakes. Fear made me a murderer." Detective Wilson was present at the sentencing. After the trial, she drove to the cemetery where Victoria Brooks was buried. Her parents had come from Denver to collect her body. They had reconciled with their daughter shortly before her death. The headstone was engraved with the words, "Victoria Brooks, beloved daughter." She was herself. Wilson left white lilies at the grave and thought about how many lives had been destroyed by a single moment of panic and fear. Mark had lost his family and his freedom. Jane and the children had lost their husband and father, and Victoria had lost everything: her dreams, her future, her very life. The case was closed as solved, but the detective knew that the scars would remain in the community for a long time. Omaha was forced to face a reality that many preferred to ignore: the existence of people who didn't fit into traditional molds, and the price of prejudice and fear.